Hi, this lecture is going to present the Four Noble Truths. These are the core doctrines of Buddhist thought, which the Buddha had discovered while meditating at a fig tree. We can divide the Four Noble Truths into two sets of two truths because there's a certain sort of parallel here. So the first two truths are, first, that there is suffering, and second, that there's an origin of suffering. So we'll talk a lot more in this lecture about what suffering is, but basically the Buddhist point is that suffering is inevitable. You can't avoid it. It pervades our lives from birth to death. Now, second, there's an origin of suffering, which means that suffering has a cause. So notice the relationship between those two truths. The first statement says that something is real or exists, namely suffering, and the second truth explains that first statement. And we have a similar structure with the third and fourth truths. So the third truth says that suffering is possible to cease, that we can put an end to suffering. And the fourth truth says how to do so, namely through what the Buddha calls the Eightfold Path. In other words, the Eightfold Path causes suffering to cease. So notice, again, we have the first truth saying something about a reality, the second truth saying something about causation. In the remainder of this lecture, I'm going to go roughly in order of the Four Noble Truths, and we'll begin by examining what the Buddha means by suffering. Now, the account that I'm presenting is following the scholar Carpenter, who I think analyzes suffering in a helpful way. So, first of all, we can identify suffering in an everyday sort of sense. So, very simple feelings like having pain, or just mere discomfort counts as suffering, just a little bit more minor. So that sort of suffering is fairly straightforward, and if that were all the Buddha were talking about, then we might say, well, suffering isn't inevitable, or it's not pervasive throughout all our lives, because we go often without that sort of pain. But there's some deeper levels. So the next level is reflective feelings, reflective sorts of pains. And these will include things like anxiety, fear, regret. So these result from being aware of the future or the past and having a negative emotional appreciation of the future or the past. With anxiety, for example, one has a negative emotional feeling because one's worried about the future and worried that, the future will involve pain, for example, or that the future won't go the sort of way that one wants it to go. Once again, if this were all the Buddha were talking about, we might say that he's being too hyperbolic in saying that suffering pervades life. Because, you can go to therapy and get over anxiety. Well, maybe you can. It's tough sometimes. But it's not that anxiety is all pervasive for everyone. But what I think is helpful here is to think that these first two kinds of suffering are like symptoms for a deeper condition or problem. So we can use sort of a medical analogy here, that we first identify some symptoms, and then we want to identify the condition that explains those symptoms. Now, the deeper condition here is the inability to be fully self-determining or to be fully in control of one's life. So this is pretty obvious because you're not always in control of how things will turn out for you. You're not in control of whether you'll get a certain job. Certain luck is a fact of life. But it's not going to be just mere random luck for the Buddha, as we'll see. He's going to explain this lack of control over our lives with a metaphysical account of how the world is. But before moving to that metaphysical account, let us note that this deeper condition explains some of the other suffering. In particular, it explains those reflective feelings. So, if you have anxiety about the future, well, that's because you're worried about the future not going as you want it to. Well, what explains the future not going as well as you want it to? Well, simply that you're not in control of things. So it's that deeper condition of not being in control that explains why you even care in a way that will lead to anxiety. But similarly, it applies to the simple feelings of pain. You don't choose to feel pain, or at least not usually. Rather, what happens when you have pain is that something else hits you, something else cuts you, something else does something to you, not in your control, and that leads to suffering. And so we see that this lack of control is really explanatory. Still, you might ask whether suffering, if we understand it as the lack of control over our lives, whether that's really pervasive and inevitable. But we can pick up on a linguistic or grammatical cue here using the word suffering. So beyond the English term to suffer, there's also a Greek term here, which is a helpful comparison. So the Greek term is pasko. It's where we get the term passive. And what does that mean? If something's passive, it's the opposite of active. If something's passive, it undergoes changes as the result of other things acting on it. In other words, something passive is not in control. Now there's something similar with the Sanskrit word dukkha. The Sanskrit word dukkha means something like to stand under. In other words, when you suffer or have dukkha, you stand under something else's control. You don't get that job that you want. You stand under the control of various forces outside of you. A much more straightforward term, in English anyway, is to say that you're dependent on other things. So I think that's the key notion here, that we have suffering because we're not independent or self-determining, but rather we depend on other things for the results of our actions to go the way that they do. So this will lead to the Buddhist metaphysics, which holds that everything stands under everything else, or that everything depends on something else or everything else. So let's now flesh that view out a little. There are three things we can highlight here. First, the Buddha will often emphasize the impermanence of everything. That is to say, nothing exists eternally or is permanent, but everything has a short life. Everything will come and go. And likewise, everything will be in constant flux or change. But this impermanence is explained by something deeper, which is the Buddhist doctrine of dependent arising. And that expresses what we saw on the previous slide. Dependent arising holds that everything is dependent and not self-determining, not an independent existence. A simple example here is that your life depends on things outside of you, depends on you getting water, depends on your environment, depends on the fact that your parents existed and did some things. Everything about you depends on other things that are outside of you. What I've just described is more of biological dependence, but what the Buddhists will say is that this goes beyond biology. And we can see that by thinking about physics, where there are laws of cause and effect, where one thing is in the state it's in because it was caused by some prior state independent of it. In other words, it's dependent on that earlier state. Now finally, as a consequence of these metaphysical views is another one, which is the doctrine of non-self, sometimes called the doctrine of no self. So it's going to hold that there is no permanent self because everything is in flux, and likewise there's no self that is totally independent, totally in charge of running its own life. Rather, we exist in a way that we're dependent on other things, and we'll talk about that view more in the next lectures. But let us continue by going through the rest of the Four Noble Truths. What we've done so far is see what the first noble truth amounts to, the claim that there's this pervasive suffering in the world because of this dependent arising. But the second noble truth says that this suffering is caused. And we have some of the cause so far, but the Buddha identifies 3 specific kinds of causes as the most important. These get described in various ways: the 3 roots of suffering, sometimes the 3 poisons, and they are greed, hatred, and delusion. And all 3 are related to another Buddhist term that you'll often hear talked about: attachment. So very briefly, greed is the state of not wanting to have a bunch of stuff so much as wanting things to be yours. Hatred is the opposite. You want things not to be joined with oneself. You want those things to be away from oneself. You want to avoid those things. So we see greed is the desire to have things for oneself. Hatred is the desire to avoid certain other things and to have yourself avoid those things. And that leads to this third one, delusion, which is not so much desire like greed and hatred, but rather it's the underlying false view that gives rise to greed and hatred. So what do both greed and hatred presuppose? They presuppose that there is a self. So if you're greedy, you want to have things for yourself. And likewise, that there is a self that can avoid things, as in hatred. So in other words, delusion is a false view about the world. And it's what gives rise to greed and hatred, sometimes jointly called craving. Notice here that delusion is the source of suffering ultimately. And what that means is to get rid of suffering, we need to come to have the right sort of views about reality. In other words, we need to do philosophy, as the Buddhist says. So that leads us to look at the way that suffering can be put to an end. And recall that that's the Noble Eightfold Path. This Noble Eightfold Path indeed begins with having a right view. So having a right view will mean that you avoid having delusion. But having a right view is not enough. That's because you need to put that view into practice and have the right mindset toward it. So that leads to the other aspects of the Eightfold Path: right intention, right speech, right action, right livelihood, right effort, right mindfulness, and right concentration. I'm not going to get into the details of what all of those amount to, but they sometimes get grouped. So the first 2 as insight, having right insight into how the world is. Then there's morality, which pertains to the right ways of behaving and engaging with others and living one's life. And then there's meditation, which groups the last 3, and that's having the right mental perspective, outlook, or what have you. Now, since we are looking at Buddhism from the standpoint of philosophy, we want to focus primarily on right view. And so what I want to do now is explain why, for the Buddha, having a right view matters so much. Once again, I'm adopting something from Amber Carpenter here. She gives the following sort of example. Imagine someone that's desperately thirsty. They might not have had any water for days, and they see a glass of clear liquid. So that liquid, it seems, could satisfy their thirst and help them to continue living. But it turns out that liquid is actually poisoned. Now, the person just acting on their desires alone would have a bad result. They would die. But a person with the right view of matters will be in a better position to act. They'll be in a position to refrain from acting on that desire to satisfy their thirst and not drink this poisoned water. So it's clear that having a right view matters. And we've seen several views that the Buddha says are true, namely concerning dependent arising and impermanence. That is, concerning the nature of suffering. Key view that needs to be adopted is the doctrine of non-self, and that will help us overcome suffering. Now, the next lecture will explain that view of the Buddhas. But right now, it's worth noting the way in which that view will help put an end to suffering. The Buddha often uses language that revolves around fire. So we can imagine the suffering self as being like a fire. Now, if we want to get rid of that suffering self, then we need to get rid of the fuel for it. So those pieces of wood that keep burning. So what we need to do is to extinguish the fire, and we'll do that by getting rid of its fuel. And the fuel that needs to be gotten rid of is the view that one has a self. Why do we need to get rid of that view? Well, recall that the most fundamental kind of suffering is not being in control, being dependent on other things. By thinking that there's a self, one is really invested in being in control. One wants to be in control of one's life to make it go better. So the idea here is to give up that project of trying to be in control of one's life. And you give up that project by getting rid of the false conception of having a self. And we'll turn to that in the next lecture.